Most controversial military decisions in American history. What happens when a nation built on ideals of freedom makes military choices that contradict those very principles? And when the smoke clears, can the decisions ever be fully justified? Throughout American history, military leaders and politicians have faced impossible choices. Some were driven by necessity, others by fear, ambition, or miscalculation. These are the most controversial military decisions in American history. Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839. This wasn't a battle. There were no enemy combatants, but it was a military operation, and it resulted in thousands of deaths. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The goal was to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to designated territories west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation resisted. They had treaties. They had won legal victories in the Supreme Court. But Jackson ignored the ruling. In 1838, federal troops under General Winfield Scott began forcing over 16,000 Cherokee people from their homes. They were given little time to gather belongings, families were separated, communities were destroyed. The journey west covered over 1,000 miles, much of it on foot. Through winter conditions, there was inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. Disease spread quickly. Exposure claimed lives daily. Estimates suggest that at least 4,000 Cherokee died during the forced march. The operation was legal under U.S. law at the time, but it violated treaties and Supreme Court decisions. Soldiers carried out orders, but witnesses, including some military personnel, reported the cruelty with discomfort. It was ethnic cleansing by policy, enforced by the military, and it set a pattern for how the United States would treat indigenous peoples for decades to come. Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. How does a military disarmament turn into one of the deadliest massacres in American history? And when fear and miscommunication collide, who pays the price? On December 29, 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry surrounded a group of Lakota Sioux near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The ghost dance movement had been spreading among Native American tribes, a spiritual practice that prophesied the return of their ancestors and the disappearance of white settlers. Army officials saw it as a potential uprising. The cavalry was ordered to disarm Chief Bigfoot's band, about 350 people, mostly women and children. Tensions were high. As soldiers searched for weapons, a shot rang out. The source remains disputed to this day. But what followed was not. Soldiers opened fire with rifles and rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns positioned on the surrounding hills. Men, women, and children tried to flee. They were cut down in the open. Some soldiers pursued fleeing survivors for miles. When the shooting stopped, at least 150 Lakota were dead, possibly as many as 300. 25 soldiers also died, many likely from friendly fire. The Army later awarded 20 Medals of Honor to soldiers involved in the massacre. The action was defended as suppressing a hostile force, but the evidence told a different story. Bodies of women and children were found miles from the initial site, shot in the back. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the final major armed conflict between the U.S. government and Native Americans. It ended not with a battle, but with a slaughter. Philippine-American War atrocities, 1899 to 1902. After the Spanish-American War, the United States took control of the Philippines. But many Filipinos who had fought for independence from Spain weren't interested in a new colonial ruler. Resistance turned into full-scale war. American forces were sent to pacify the islands, and the conflict quickly became brutal. General Jacob Smith issued orders on the island of Samar that left no room for interpretation. He told his troops to kill everyone over the age of 10 and turn the interior into a howling wilderness. Civilian casualties mounted. Villages were burned. Concentration camps were established to separate insurgents from the population. Water torture, known then as the water cure, became a documented interrogation method. Soldiers would force water down a prisoner's throat until their stomach distended, then beat or jump on the abdomen to expel it. The practice was widely reported in American newspapers, sparking outrage back home. Official estimates put Filipino deaths at around 200,000 civilians, though some historians suggest the toll was much higher. American soldiers justified harsh tactics by pointing to guerrilla ambushes and the difficulty of identifying combatants. But courts-martial followed, and some officers were reprimanded. The war ended with American control, but the methods used became a stain on the military's record. It raised a question that would echo through future conflicts. When does counterinsurgency become state-sponsored terror? Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. In the final days of World War II, the United States faced a critical decision. Japan had not surrendered despite heavy bombing across dozens of cities. American planners estimated that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland could result in hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. But there was another option, one that had never been used before. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Both cities were largely destroyed. Civilian casualties were immense. Tens of thousands lost their lives instantly, with many more dying in the weeks and months that followed from radiation exposure and injuries. Japan surrendered shortly after, bringing the war to an end. Supporters of the decision argued it forced Japan's surrender and prevented an even higher death toll from a mainland invasion. But from the start, critics inside and outside the military questioned the necessity and morality of the strikes. Japan's military capacity was already collapsing, and the Soviet Union had just entered the war against Japan. And there was one detail that raised even more concern. The bombs primarily struck city centers. Hospitals, schools, and homes were flattened alongside any military or industrial targets. Some U.S. officials later admitted alternatives had existed but were dismissed. The speed and scale of destruction shocked even many of those who authorized it. Decades later, the debate continues. Was it a necessary evil that saved lives, or the first act of nuclear terrorism? U.S. firebombing of Tokyo, 1945. In a single night in March 1945, more people died in Tokyo than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And unlike those cities, no nuclear weapon was used. On March 9th, nearly 300 U.S. bombers took off from bases in the Mariana Islands. Their target was Tokyo, primarily its civilian residential areas, alongside some industrial sites. The plan was to use incendiary bombs dropped at low altitude to ignite the city's wooden residential neighborhoods. The result was catastrophic. The fires merged into a massive firestorm. Entire blocks were erased in minutes. Civilians were trapped in canals, stairwells, and shelters that collapsed under the heat. Around 100,000 people lost their lives, and more than 1 million were left homeless overnight. The stated goal was to cripple Japan's ability to continue the war by destroying its urban workforce and infrastructure. But the overwhelming majority of casualties were civilians. Military value was secondary. Some U.S. officials defended the raid as necessary to break Japanese morale and industrial capacity. Yet others, including some senior commanders, questioned whether the scale of destruction could ever be justified, even in total war. The bombing of Tokyo was followed by similar attacks on more than 60 other Japanese cities, but the sheer concentration of death and destruction in that one night made the Tokyo firebombing one of the most controversial air campaigns in U.S. military history. It blurred the line between strategic bombing and deliberate targeting of civilians. My Lai Massacre, 1968. In March 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, American soldiers entered a small village called My Lai. Intelligence suggested it was a Viet Cong stronghold. The mission was to search and destroy. But when Charlie Company arrived, they found no enemy fighters, just civilians. Elderly men, women, children, and infants. What happened next shocked the world. Over the course of several hours, U.S. troops systematically killed between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers. Homes were burned, livestock slaughtered. Some soldiers refused to participate, but most followed orders. The massacre continued until a helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson Jr., landed his aircraft between the soldiers and fleeing civilians, ordering his crew to fire on American troops if they advanced. The Army initially covered it up, calling it a military victory. But a year later, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. Courts-martial followed. Only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. The incident became a symbol of everything wrong with the Vietnam War. It raised questions that still echo today. When does following orders become a crime? And how does a military prevent atrocities when the enemy blends with the population? The massacre at My Lai remains one of the darkest moments in American military history, a stark reminder that even disciplined forces can commit unspeakable acts under the fog of war. Internment of Japanese Americans, 1942 to 1945. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The stated reason was a military necessity. The fear was sabotage and espionage on the West Coast. But what followed had nothing to do with evidence or individual guilt. Over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to internment camps. They were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry. Businesses were abandoned. Property was sold at a fraction of its value or simply seized. Families were transported to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. They lived in cramped barracks with little privacy and endured harsh conditions from desert heat to freezing winters. There were no trials, no charges, no due process. Children attended makeshift schools inside the camps. Young men were eventually allowed to volunteer for military service, and many did, serving with distinction in units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated in U.S. history, all while their families remained imprisoned. The military and government defended the policy as a wartime precaution, but internal reports at the time found no evidence of widespread disloyalty among Japanese Americans. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized and provided reparations to survivors. The internment camps are now recognized as a grave injustice, driven by racism and wartime hysteria rather than genuine security concerns. It stands as a reminder of how fear can override constitutional rights. Operation Rolling Thunder and bombing of Cambodia, 1965 to 1973. How does a limited bombing campaign turn into one of the longest and most controversial air wars in history? And what happens when a secret expansion of that war destabilizes an entire nation? In 1965, the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to weaken the North's ability to support Viet Cong forces in the South and force them to the negotiating table. For over 3 years, American aircraft dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on North Vietnamese targets. But the strategy failed. The North adapted, moving supplies at night, rebuilding infrastructure quickly, and relying on support from China and the Soviet Union. The bombing didn't break their will, it hardened it. Then came an even more controversial decision. In 1969, President Nixon secretly authorized the bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country. The target was Viet Cong and North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation, codenamed Menu, was kept hidden from Congress and the American public. Over the next 4 years, the U.S. dropped more than 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. The results were catastrophic. Civilian casualties mounted. The bombing destabilized the Cambodian government and contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal regime that would go on to kill nearly 2 million of its own people. Critics argue the secret bombing campaign violated international law and Cambodia's sovereignty. Supporters claimed it was necessary to disrupt enemy supply lines, but the long-term consequences were undeniable. The expansion of the war into Cambodia became one of the most debated decisions of the Vietnam era, raising questions about executive power, transparency, and the unintended consequences of military action. Invasion of Iraq, 2003. What happens when a government goes to war for reasons it claims are certain, and those reasons turn out to be false? And once the damage is done, can the mission still be justified? In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The claim was direct. Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. These weren't vague allegations. U.S. officials cited specific stockpiles, mobile weapons labs, and delivery systems. So the mission was launched with heavy airstrikes and rapid ground deployment. Major cities fell in days, and Baghdad collapsed within weeks. But then they ran into a problem. There were no WMDs. Investigators secured bunkers and suspected sites. Nothing. No chemical stockpiles. No active nuclear effort. No confirmed operational ties to the 9/11 attacks. The intelligence once presented as urgent and credible was unraveling. The failure wasn't caused by a single misstep. Analysts had raised doubts, and some sources were known to be weak. But in the rush to act, driven by post-9/11 urgency and pressure to appear decisive, those doubts were ignored, and uncertainty was presented as fact. Now, with the original goal no longer valid, the mission had to be changed. So they decided on a new purpose: nation-building. A new government was installed. Saddam Hussein was captured and later executed. Elections were held, but stability never came. Insurgencies formed, and sectarian violence escalated. Over the next several years, the human and strategic cost only grew. Thousands of American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians lost their lives. The region destabilized in ways that are still being felt today. The invasion of Iraq became a case study in how intelligence failures, political pressure, and mission creep can turn a swift military victory into a prolonged strategic disaster. Throughout American history, military decisions have been made under pressure, in the fog of war, with incomplete information, and sometimes with fatal certainty. Some were driven by survival, others by fear, prejudice, or ambition. The most controversial ones share a pattern. They prioritized short-term objectives over long-term consequences, or they crossed moral lines in pursuit of military goals. So which of these decisions do you think had the most lasting impact? Are any of them justified? And are there others from American military history that deserve to be on this list? Let us know in the comments. And if you made it this far, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. Subscribe to see more videos like this from us in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time.